Hi, I'm Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt, Rabbi of Congregation B'nai Tzedek and Chairman of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to join us on this conversation today, which is a very important one, dealing with what's happening in the Soviet invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. To talk and to share and to shed light on this is a policy analyst with the Washington Institute. In fact, Anna Borshchevskaya is the Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Program on Great Power Competition and the Middle East, holds that chair. She focuses primarily on Russia's policy towards the Middle East, and in fact has written a book which has been widely acclaimed. It's called Putin's War in Syria, Russian Foreign Policy and the Price of America's Absence. She's also a contributor to Oxford Analytica and a fellow at the European Foundation for Democracy. She's been with the Atlantic Council, the Peterson Institute, and many other places where she has served as a policy analyst and is a frequent contributor to a number of publications in regard to situation with Russia and the Middle East. Today's program is being brought to you by the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, which is a coalition of rabbis from all denominations across the country who are motivated to promote greater understanding and unity between Jews of diaspora and of Israel. We'll be holding a conference for rabbis May 22 to May 24 here in Washington, D.C. You can go on our website, zionistrabbis.org, to learn more about that and the mission of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, and being co-hosted today by Congregation B'nai Tzedek. So we have rabbis, we have other individuals who are joining us, and things are happening very, very rapidly. So let me go straight to Anna, who's going to open with some comments. And then after that, will be anyone who has any questions, please submit them on the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will have time for your questions. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be able to hear from you today about your perspective on what's happening, what are the broader implications, how do we get here, where do we go from here? All of these things are on everybody's mind, please.
Sure, Rabbi. Thank you very much for this generous introduction. I'm going to be brief to start off with opening remarks so that we can spend as much time as possible really having a discussion, because I'm sure that everybody has all sorts of questions. I want to make sure we focus on what matters to you. So I simply want to say a few words for setting the stage in terms of how we got here and how to understand what's happening essentially right now. Vladimir Putin it came, as I'm sure this audience knows very well, from the KGB, from a very particular mindset of Russia's most notorious security services. When the Cold War ended approximately 30 years ago, we in the West assumed that liberalism has triumphed, and we famously declared the end of history. American foreign policy very quickly turned to counterterrorism after September 11th. These ideas of great power competition, of kind of broader geopolitics, were no longer at the forefront of Western thought, especially American thought, America as the leader, as a global leader overall, and of course of the free world in particular. But the people who came to power, Vladimir Putin and people around him, and I should say they emerged in the mid-1990s. Certainly officially Putin became Russia's president in May 2000, but the seeds of what happened in Russia at that period were actually sown in the 1990s. Russia, for its part, I would argue at least, lost its opportunity to transition to a true liberal Western-style democracy very early into the 1990s. And really by mid-1990s is where you saw anti-Western voices taking over, and liberals were very quickly discredited. In fact, I'm not sure if they even had a chance at all, but the fact of the matter is, when it came to government positions, they very quickly became discredited. In particular, one man named Yevgeny Primakov became Russia's foreign minister in 1996, and what he did is he chartered officially, he kind of outlined officially what others had been saying in previous years, and that is sort of a vision of Russia's foreign policy as pursuing a multipolar world. And in Primakov's vision in particular, this vision of a multipolar world, it was fundamentally an anti-American vision. It was an idea that American primacy in world affairs had disadvantaged Russia. And Russia needed to create alternatives. And to do that, Russia needed to create a triangle with China and India to counterbalance American influence. And Russia needed to return to regions where it held a lot of influence, chief of which was the Middle East, especially because Primakov in particular was a skilled Arabist himself, with also not only with a history and intelligence, but particularly in the Middle East. He was a fluent Arabic speaker. And so Putin and his circle, they never forgave the loss of the Cold War. Now, they didn't want communism back. If anything, people in the KGB had seen, probably better than others, the total failure that the idea of communism really was. So they were not looking to bring back communism. What they wanted was a victory. They resented that they simply lost. They lost in the greatest geopolitical battle of the century at the time. In fact, one of Putin's famous quotes, that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It was not about it. Many analysts had misunderstood, because he didn't want to bring communism back, but he wanted Russia to be back as a great power. And in Putin's view, to be a great power it had to be zero sum. America had to be brought down to size. So Putin pursued this vision from the very beginning of coming to power. It's just that he was much more cautious in his early years for a whole host of reasons, and he simply became more emboldened and more self-confident. He's been in power at this stage over 20 years, so he has experience that other democratic leaders don't have. And when you think about what is unfolding today, specifically in Ukraine, it is the result of both his desire and pursuit of reducing American primacy, and also a result of his perception of the West as weak and risk averse. In many ways, Putin's invasion of Ukraine began in Georgia in 2008, when he took away the breakaway republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So Abkhazia, for its part, borders the Black Sea. And again, there's several layers to this, of course. He didn't want any country joining the West, because the idea of any country becoming a successful pro-Western democracy meant that in his in kind of the not just the Russian state interpretation, meant that that somehow that reduced Russia. In other words, again, it was a zero-sum vision. If another country on Russia's periphery could succeed in becoming a liberal, stable democracy, it would create an example for other people, for people within Russia, that changes could happen in Russia as well. And Putin did not want that. The fact of the matter is, Ukraine, interestingly enough, I realize that there's lots of misconceptions out there about Ukraine, but one of them is that Ukraine is just like Russia, that there are certainly very close connections, lots of history, but when it comes to political ideas, Ukraine in particular is actually a competitor to Russia. It's a historic competitor to Russia. It did not begin with Vladimir Putin, because Ukraine had a history of democracy, of freedom. Certainly Ukraine had a lot of problems with corruption, but when it came to the realm of political ideas, Ukraine stood in fundamental contrast with Russia's authoritarianism. And Ukraine, frankly, is the one country that was able to escape Putin's grip, and that is one reason of several why he is so determined to punish Ukraine and to destroy it. He also genuinely does not believe that Ukraine is a real country. Now, and this brings us to another kind of bigger picture of what's happening here. There are many, of course, famous quotes of Putin, but one that I particularly like to highlight, because it has not received enough attention, is when he said that very few countries have true sovereignty. And in this list of countries that have true sovereignty, he obviously listed Russia and the United States, China and India. Even Europe was not really on that list. And this highlights something very important that is happening right now that I think is hard maybe for general audiences to grasp. In the liberal post-World War II, rules-based global order, small states matter and have sovereignty. At the same time, there are limits to what governments can do to their people in this vision, again, of a post-Cold War world. The World War II was so devastating and so horrific that we created institutions that promised to never again have the world face that horror. And the underpinning ideas of these institutions is, again, that first, small states matter, and second, that there are limits to what a government can do to its people. Putin resents both of these ideas, and what he's trying to do is undermine this very foundation. He believes that there are great powers, and great powers, there are very few of them, and great powers have spheres of influence. And these great powers can do whatever they want to their own people and to their neighbors. So what we're seeing today is a fundamental clash of these ideas, a fundamental impossibility of having the two coexist at the same time. That is what's unfolding today, and that transcends Ukraine. That matters to everybody, and certainly matters to the liberal free world. In Syria, what Putin had done is he's propped up an authoritarian leader who really spared no depravity to stay in power, who is guilty of war crimes. And the fact that Putin supported a man who is guilty of war crimes tells you volumes about his worldview. And again, this underpins what's happening today. Now, a few other points I want to make, so as I not speak for too long. Putin genuinely believes that the West is out to get him and leaders like him, that the West is behind all popular unrest, be it the so-called color revolutions in the post-Soviet space, or the Arab Spring, or protest Russia. So Russia, historically in Russia, the offensive and defensive tends to blend together in a way that we can't fully understand, because Western thought is different. We are different. And so from our perspective, what we see as fundamentally offensive in Russian military statecraft and strategic statecraft is simultaneously offensive and defensive. That's why Putin couldn't stomach the Orange Revolution of Ukraine. That's why he couldn't let the United States overthrow Assad. That is why he's doing this today. Over the years, Putin has grown increasingly emboldened because he saw that the West was risk averse. The West was always worried about escalating anything with Russia. We saw this unfold time and time again. I can give more specific examples during Q&A because they're very specific. We're always worried that Russia will find our steps as escalatory, and Russia keeps escalating. Crucially, Putin never really paid a price for his aggression. Again, be it in Georgia, a little bit perhaps, but ultimately he got away with his war in Georgia. Certainly not in Crimea, even though he got away with annexing Crimea very quickly at low cost. In particular in Syria, again, Syria was a challenge to the US global order, and Putin not only got away with his intervention, but established a strategic position for Russia. And that strategic position fundamentally created leverage for him to pressure Ukraine. And so Middle East theaters and European theaters, this is something that I argue over and over again, are very much connected in Russian statecraft. We tend to separate them in the West, and that's a big mistake. From the Russian perspective, they look at this in very much holistic terms, the so-called southern vulnerable underbelly that historically worried the Russian state, included the Middle East and Central Asia, the Caucasus, and certainly the Black Sea. And so it's a very different view of geography. And so what also brings us to today is the failure of the United Nations to live up to its promise, right? The United Nations was created precisely to prevent a war such as the one we're seeing today. The fact of the matter is nobody really expected the Security Council to stop it, because Russia is a permanent member and was also chairing the Security Council that month. But again, it just lays to bear the complete ineptitude of liberal post-World War II international institutions. And I guess I'll conclude with a few more thoughts, kind of looking into the future. In my view, Putin is rational. There's been a lot of talk immediately after the invasion about his state of mind, that he must be crazy because only a crazy person would do something like this. I'm obviously not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but the fact of the matter is, the fact that the only way we can explain what he's doing is that he's crazy, again, points to a fundamental difference between us and a kind of cognitive dissonance, excuse me, between our worldview and his worldview. The fact of the matter is, war had been a rational choice, unfortunately, for most rulers for most of human existence. It's just that we forgot what that's like, because American leadership, American primacy in world affairs, has created an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity that, from a very big sort of millennial perspective of human history, has never existed before. And we forgot how hard life really is, how fragile life really is. And the only way we can explain it is by saying that he's irrational, but I think he's very rational. I think we're in for a lot more pain. Putin's choices are likely to continue to escalate. I think we're going to see Ukraine continuously brutalized in the weeks ahead. Certainly the Middle East is already been affected by this, and is going to continue being affected by this tragedy. It is the largest war that we've seen in Europe since World War II, and the fastest, and the refugee crisis that is moving at World War II rates. And so rather, I see my last concluding thoughts, Western commentators rush to conclude that Putin has already lost. And I don't think that's wrong. I do think long-term, yes, he's lost quite a bit, but the fact of the matter is we've lost a lot here as well. And this fight is not over. And rather than focusing on the fact that he's already lost, we need to focus on how we can save Ukraine now. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Wow, there is so much there. That's unbelievable. Thank you. We're starting to get some questions, and I'm going to start with just a few, and then hopefully get to some of the ones there. One of the first questions I have then is there any hope that the sanctions upon Russia and or upon the oligarchs are going to have any impact on the way in which Putin acts?
Most of the sanctions, no. The fact of the matter is, sanctions by design are meant to have long-term effects. And even if you listen to President Biden's speech in the beginning of the war, he said nobody expected sanctions to stop the war. He was actually quite candid about it. Oligarchs don't have any power. This is a pyramid where Putin sits on top. The oligarchs have already spoken out, not only the oligarchs, but their children even have spoken out against the war. So I think certainly sanctions are going to cripple the Russian military-industrial complex over the years. What I wonder also is, especially if the most recent round of sanctions that targets oil might be a little bit more potent, because that is also what's helping fuel the war right now. But overall, we have been unfortunately over-reliant on sanctions as a substitute for policy, because it's easier for us to deal with. It's cleaner.
It's not just a substitute for policy, if I may interrupt. It seems to be a substitute for any kind of military response.
Absolutely, well, absolutely. And it's an easier domestic sell. It's sort of like it's like a tennis player that has an overstrengthened arm, because that's what they're used to playing with. That's what sanctions have become. Sanctions are a useful tool when it is one of many tools of a strategy.
So how does this play out then? The sanctions are going to be limited. Putin is not going to give up. What do you see in the near future?
So what I see happening is in 3 weeks, 3 million people became refugees that are flooding Europe. And by expert predictions that I've seen even right before the war in February, the numbers were between 5 to 10 million. If to give you a rate of comparison, during the in Syria, the numbers that we're seeing today took more than 2 years. So in a matter of actually 2 weeks, really, what took 2 weeks in Syria, put it this way, took 2 weeks in Ukraine. Okay, and so a number of 5 to 10 million is a very realistic number. If things continue, Russia is suffering severe losses major losses, and I'd happy to provide more details on that. But the fact of the matter is they still have a lot more to bring to bear, and that's why Zelensky is really begging for more military aid. Ukraine has held as long as it did, in part due to its resolve and training, but also due to our help. However, it hasn't been enough. And so what that means is, kind of to go back to my point about refugees in terms of your question, what could happen is there will be more pressure on Zelensky to go on some kind of a concession. The fact of the matter is, there's already his team is already talking to Putin. I'm not confident that whatever is going to come out of today will yield any positive results, but Putin is at a point where he has to escalate, and he's also never let any refugee crisis go unweaponized. That's what he did. He's weaponized the refugee crisis in Syria, and I think he's going to weaponize the refugee crisis in Ukraine.
What do you mean by weaponize?
What I mean by weaponize is major refugee flows create serious pressure on any country. And when you're faced with having to house refugees, to take care of refugees at such an unprecedented rate, it is going to create a lot of economic pain. It's very difficult. Now, at this stage, I think that there's still a lot of, thank God, a lot of sympathy for Ukraine and understanding. And finally, also Central and Eastern European countries have emerged as a stronger voice in Europe. But what I worry about is that as this pressure mounts, refugee pressure mounts, and what I mean by weaponizing is that Putin will create through his brutal military tactics, will push more refugees into Europe.
So in terms of that, what is it that only will stop it? In other words, you foresee other nations coming to the aid of Ukraine? Is there a possibility that Putin may feel so backed in the corner that he may use a nuclear option?
I mean, I think that's unlikely. I think that's a question that everybody is asking. And yes, I think if he fundamentally feels his existence threatened, I don't think it's wise to exclude anything. He has a famous comment where he says that who needs a world if there's no Russia in it?
Wow.
And that comment kind of hinted at the possible use of nuclear weapons. Now, of course, he likes to threaten nuclear weapons. I think he would prefer to not fight a war with NATO and prefer not to use nuclear weapons. Would he absolutely not use it? No one can.
Is he afraid of NATO, or is he afraid of anyone or anything?
I think he understands that NATO is a very potent force. I don't think he wants a war with NATO again, but I think he's prepared for it if necessary. In fact, I think that's why we're seeing Russia. Actually, I know it's going to sound odd maybe to this audience, but he's actually been fairly timid. There's a lot more he can bring to bear, and I think he's doing that precisely because of a possibility of war with.
Do you think he's surprised by the amount of losses that they've had?
Well, I think he's absolutely furious at how the initial stage of the invasion went. They expected it to be over in basically about 2 days.
And is there any possibility of internal opposition within Russia to what he's doing?
Not in a way that I think that we hope. There's certainly a lot of opposition. There's no shortage of protests, although Russia has seen far bigger protests. In terms of sheer numbers, Russia has seen far bigger protests a little more than a decade ago. And the Russian people are feeling the pain of sanctions. But I think if you want to talk about a protest that would topple him, I just don't think we're quite there. I think that's a little bit naive to expect that. And there are a whole host of reasons for this. One, Russian propaganda remains fairly effective. There's also a degree of cognitive dissonance within the cognitive dissonance. I apologize, within the Russian public itself, because they do have they're not completely cut off from information the way the Soviet public was, but it's human nature, not in that. Just because there's access to information doesn't mean you will believe it. Latest polls actually do show that the majority of Russians, the most credible polls, I should say, a lot of them are not credible, but the most credible polls still show that a slim majority of Russians support the war in Ukraine. So again, and that's not because that's not because there's no shortage of opposition, but everybody who needed to be silenced, put it this way, had been silenced before this war. So I just think I think at this stage it's highly unlikely that there will be a mass uprising that will bring him down.
So speaking of silencing those who would be opposed to the war, we've seen that Putin will stop at no ends in terms of his ruthlessness. What he'll do to what he did to Navalny, to Nemtsov, and others. Can you tell us? People are concerned obviously about the Zelensky and his life, and in the same response, how do you evaluate Zelensky's response to what's been going on? And do you think Russia's a little bit surprised by how effective he's been?
Couple things. Interestingly enough, in the run-up to the war, the Ukrainians were a little bit more complacent than we were. I know it's going to be a little bit odd to hear, but in the run-up to the war, Zelensky was asking publicly to not be so hysterical.
Right.
He was saying that our hysteria was driving businesses away. In that run-up, I actually think they should have taken our advice a little bit more seriously. But the fact of the matter is, and by the way, the Ukrainian military assessment agreed with ours, so it's not the issue of a military assessment necessarily. But Zelensky emerged immediately as a leader, and it was clear that he was determined to stay and fight for his country. His acting background, I think, probably helped him in a positive way, because I think that's what he's acted in a way that a country needs when they're under attack. It's legitimate, and he's tried to rally people's support, and I think he did it in the way he did it was effective. Ukrainians also had 8 years since 2014, since Crimea, where they had received more training, more not enough, again, I would say, but more equipment from us. Ultimately, they had the resolve, and that's the morale is what it comes down to. So the Ukrainian military was ready to defend its country. There's unity. The Russian government lied to its military. They told many troops that they were going for a military exercise, and they were so when these young boys were shipped off to Ukraine, many of them had no idea that they were going to be fighting a war. Many of them were horrified. There was many were told that they were going to liberate Ukrainians from a quote unquote Nazi government, and when they saw that this simply wasn't the case, they were horrified by what they were made to do. So in terms of morale, in terms of resolve, Ukraine, of course, had a leg up, but in terms of actually military tactics, what I will say is that despite a lot of euphoria that we saw in the West in terms of how well Ukraine is held, Russia they quickly recalibrated after the initial loss, and this shows you that they had alternate plans if the invasion did not work out. They did prepare for it in at least in some capacity. They attacked Ukraine on 4 fronts, and their biggest gains were in the south of Ukraine. South of Ukraine is especially important, east and south, but south is especially important because it connects Ukraine to the Black Sea. So all the cities that Mariupol, all these other cities that they have either besieged, or the one city that they took was Kherson. All of these are strategically important for cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea. And they still have a lot more resources to bear. If you look on Twitter, on social media, again, it's a little bit misleading in how the Ukrainian, these tactical victories ultimately weren't really leading to battlefield gains. And so in terms of how this may play out, Russia can very easily still take parts of Ukraine and basically dismember the state. You could very easily foresee a scenario where Western Ukraine becomes kind of a rump state with a government in exile, with some kind of insurgency and a government in opposition that we support. But to go back to your earlier question, I think Ukraine has earned everyone's respect as a leader, and I think he's doing everything he can for his country.
So, but he should be concerned for his life, yes?
I do think he should be concerned for his life. Yes, the Ukrainian military was skillful in thwarting, I think, 4 attacks on his life. But by going into Kiev openly as he did, he does risk his life. And just because 4 attempts failed doesn't mean that there won't be others. The FSB does know how to do this. They've assassinated many people before, and ultimately, Ukraine needs Zelensky alive. So I do worry that his life will remain in danger.
Let me turn to the aspect of how this plays out vis-a-vis the whole situation with Iran. What is Russia's relationship with Iran right now? Also, how does this play out in terms of the negotiations currently going on for the renewal of the JCPOA with Iran? And I've read it, which I don't quite understand, that Russia is kind of representing the United States in those negotiations. What is the nature of that? And then, of course, not to make the question more complicated than it already is, but vis-a-vis Syria. And then we'll get to Israel separately. But for right now, let's just talk about it vis-a-vis primarily Russia and Iran. Help us understand that relationship, and also in regard to the JCPOA.
Sure. And if I may start with a little bit of historical background, because I think it might be helpful. Although Russia and Iran have a very complicated centuries-old history, but by the end of the Cold War, they began to improve ties. Historically, also, Iran lost wars to Russia, not the other way around. And with the warming of ties with the end of the Cold War, what happened in the 1990s, especially, even at a time when, during the early years of Boris Yeltsin, when the relationship with the West was at its best that Russia had, the one sticking point in the bilateral relationship was Russia's relationship with Iran. Because Russia began supplying Iran with arms, it began helping Iran with its nuclear program, and raised concerns for Israel and the United States, even in those early years. And I want to underscore that because I think, because it highlights not just short-term tactical interest, but also long-term interest. And the fact of the matter is, in order for Russia to compete in the 1990s even, it looked to Iran. It looked to its advantages, and Russia's advantages were in the nuclear arms field, and that's where Iran was. So under Putin especially, slowly the Russia-Iran relationship began to improve. And ultimately, it was Syria that brought it to unprecedented heights. Really, the warming of Russian-Iranian ties, because of after the Syrian uprising, was unprecedented in the grand scope of 500 years of history. The fact of the matter is, what Putin's approach to the Middle East was always, it was a Primakov's vision of a multipolar world, and what that entailed was building contacts with all governments and major opposition movements to them. This is fundamentally different how the Soviet Union pursued the Middle East. It's a flexible approach. But as flexible as it was, Putin remained closer to anti-American actors in the region, and that was chiefly Iran and Assad and Iranian proxies. One of the chief reasons why Putin kept his Syria intervention low cost is because Iran did most of the heavy lifting. The Syria intervention was, again, was a success because Iran did most of the work, simply put. So Russia and Iran in the Middle East actually come as one strategic set. And that is something that Western analysts for many years kind of tended to downplay, and again, pointing to a lot of disagreements between Russia and Iran and so forth. In Syria in particular, Russia always played the card of saying that Russia can limit Iranian influence in Syria, but we haven't really seen that happen in a meaningful way. And when it comes to the JCPOA, there's also a long history here. Historically, Russia always diluted sanctions against Iran. Now, Russia sort of played a double game, where at first it said, yes, we're worried about the Iranian nuclear program, and there was a degree of truth to that. Russia would have preferred a non-nuclear Iran. But then they would turn around and act as one person who was part of the negotiation would tell me, as Iran's lawyer, by saying that Western concerns about the Iranian nuclear program were overblown, that sanctions were hurting Russia-Iran trade, and that was Russia's chief concern. They wanted Russia-Iran trade. So in order to participate in order to agree to the original JCPOA, Russia extracted concessions of lessening sanctions and a whole host of other concessions that came with ballistic missiles in Europe. the Obama administration had gone on really unprecedented concessions to have Russia be part of the JCPOA. And again, Russia at the time had given nothing in return. But be that as it may, that is how the JCPOA come to pass. And the moment the ink was dry on the agreement, before Russia went ahead and sold the S-300 system to Iran, which is an anti-aircraft system that a sale of which Russia had frozen under a lot of American and Israeli pressure in the previous years. So ultimately, now once Trump had exited the JCPOA, Russia, of course, played the card of America being an unreliable ally, an unreliable partner, and so forth. But ultimately, if you looked at the Russian-Iranian bilateral trade, the cancellation of the JCPOA didn't really hurt Russia. In fact, you actually saw trade go up a little bit. So by the time this new round of negotiations came, Russia was actually in a very good position, because on the one hand, it's clear that the Biden administration wants the Iran deal. Western European leaders want the Iran deal. But Russia kind of had it both ways. They were okay. If there was no Iran deal when it came to trade, they would have been okay. But also they wanted to look like they were part of a major international diplomatic effort that needed Russia, because Russia is a great power, wants to be seen as a country without which you cannot make chief international decisions, right? And also it can signal that it has some leverage over Iran. And so what we're seeing playing out today, most recently, is because of how much pressure Russia is under because of Ukraine. They started making these additional demands of saying that the talks will be suspended unless Russia receives written guarantees that Russia-Iran trade is not going to be affected. They've most recently signaled they have received some guarantees. It's unclear to me what those guarantees were. It's only been in the last several days that this happened.
So help us understand a little bit vis-a-vis that Syria is a client. It has been acting as a proxy for Iran, who, if I understand you correctly, is in certain respects acting as a proxy for Russia, and yet they allow Israel to bomb in Syria. So do you understand what I'm getting at?
That's not exactly right. What's happening? It's basically a triangle. What I was saying is that Russia's closest partnerships are with Iran and the Assad regime. Out of all countries in the Middle East. But what's happening is it's a triangle of Russia, Iran, and Assad. And Assad also plays both sides as well. When it comes to, and this is why, this is why I'm also skeptical. But there are many reasons why I'm very skeptical that Russia will ever get Iran out of Syria. But the fact of the matter is, in the previous years, it was also Iran that saved Assad from an imminent fall. So this relationship is one where everybody agrees on the need to reduce American presence in the Middle East, and on keeping Assad in power. There's certain strategic goals, objectives that all of them agree upon, if that makes sense. And Assad is also very skillful at playing everybody against each other.
But the aspect that I want to try and understand is, unless I'm wrong, and correct me, is that Russia has allowed Israel to bomb Iranian sites. It seems to be as if the red line, Israel's paid a very clear red line, and that is Hezbollah can do what they want, Syria can do what they want, but if things are being transferred from Iran to Lebanon, that's where we're going to not allow it. And the Russians appear to at least be turning a blind eye and or not using their anti-aircraft, et cetera, et cetera. So why is Russia allowing Israel to be able to act in Syria? That's the first question. And we'll come back to Israel in just a moment after.
Sure. Yeah, that's the reason why Russia is allowing Israel to act in Syria is because ultimately Russia wants, in any kind of a situation, a power situation, right? Russia wants to be stronger than everybody else. It sees itself on top of a pyramid. That is historic Russian statecraft. It's not just Putin. And if Israeli airstrikes weaken Iran a little bit, that is to Russia's advantage. But at the same time, ultimately, it's not going to Russia wants Iran weakened a little bit, but not to the point where it cannot do a lot of the hard work it needs to do in Syria. And so allowing Israel to make these airstrikes, it's not fundamentally threatening Iran. It's targeting foot soldiers, and And so it's easy to do. And this is why I think Israel has been a little bit naive over the years in kind of interpreting Russia's looking the other way as a signal that Russia supports Israel, or that can limit Iranian proxies in any kind of meaningful way. It's a very kind of nuanced game. Does that make sense? And does that answer your question?
Most definitely. Yeah. No, you're shedding a lot of light on things that have been very opaque for quite some time. So let's talk a little bit more about Israel right now. As we all know that, Bennett is playing this role, or seem to be playing a role. Is there any real potential for it? And how do we understand what Israel can or should do? It's very interesting because they have the, good cop, bad cop. Lapid as foreign minister taking a hard line. Bennett as the prime minister, a less hard line. And obviously we know that's all scripted. It's not just coincidental. But is there any possibility for Israel to play a role? What should Israel be doing? What should their concerns be about all of this? And again, it still comes back to Iran at the end of the day as well. So please, your comments about that.
I think the first thing to understand is that when it comes to diplomacy, Russia plays a very different game than we do. It's hard for me to see how Israel could play a role of a genuine mediator. First, because Russia uses diplomatic events like this as tactical pauses, as strategic pauses to reposition its troops. The shelling of Ukraine has not stopped, even as so-called peace talks continue. That is exactly the strategy that they deployed in Syria, and that is what they're deploying in Ukraine. They've done that in Chechnya as well. So Russia is simply not a good faith negotiator, because they're approaching it they're not approaching it from good faith. And in fact, another great example is the humanitarian corridors that we saw. And again, I immediately saw echoes of this in Syria the moment the first humanitarian corridor was discussed, because in Syria, Russia used humanitarian corridors against ceasefires to bomb civilians, to direct them into Assad controlled areas. And what you saw unfolding in Ukraine is exactly the same thing. Russia saying, yes, you can have a humanitarian corridor, but refugees have to go into Russia and Belarus. Well, so how do you expect a refugee to feel safe going into a country that invaded them and a country that helped them create the invasion? That's the first step. Second, of course, you saw shelling of civilians that were moving. So that is how Russia looks at peace talks, and I that's very important to understand. The second part is to go back to my earlier comment about how Putin views states. Putin would not view Israel, or really most other countries, as kind of worthy interlocutors in a negotiation like this. So if I recall correctly, it was actually the Ukrainian side that asked for Israeli mediation. But for Putin, now what he also wants is worldwide acceptance as a great leader. And so having this theater of a negotiation with an intermediary, that is also to his advantage, especially because he's so isolated on the world stage. He's faced such widespread shunning, that having something that looks like peace talks, again, is that this kind of theater is to his advantage as well. But I just don't see what leverage also Israel really has. And because when it comes to peace negotiations, that there's a process. I just don't see how Israel is really in a position to mediate in the way we think about genuine conflict mediation.
So is there a certain naivete that has been operated in the last 10, 20, 30 years in American foreign policy, going back to some of the original points that you were making? I think a little bit about a few things. I think about the book by President Kennedy, While England Slept, talking about the inevitability in certain respects, and the ignoring of what was happening in Nazi Germany during World War II. And I also recall that in the 2012 presidential debate with Obama and Romney, and Romney said that Russia was the greatest threat to world peace. And Obama in a very snarky kind of way just put him down and said, oh, you're calling foreign policy for the 1980s. So is there naivete in certain quarters in America?
Yeah, we absolutely, not just America, but also Europe, and basically liberal Western democracy. I think there's been, Israel included, Israel is part of that family of liberal Western democracies. I think absolutely there has been a naivete, and it is tragic that this was the wake-up call, that it had to be this painful, that the West is finally at least talking about reassessing some of its fundamental assumptions about Russian strategy, Russian statecraft. I don't know yet where it's going to lead. What's happening, of course, in Europe, there are many, with Ukraine, there are many parallels. There are some differences as well. And one, of course, is that Putin is not perpetuating a genocide that Hitler had envisioned, and that there's no mass extermination camps. There are mass executions of civilians, a whole host of other atrocities, and Putin is committed to dismembering Ukraine as a state, destroying Ukrainian statehood for sure. We're not seeing concentration camps, at least not yet. And the other difference is Zelensky did receive help. It's a very interesting situation in that respect, in that you're not seeing, Czechoslovakia. So, for example, Czechoslovakia had zero help when Hitler invaded. So you're not seeing kind of the same level of appeasement that you saw in the run-up to World War II, but you're also not seeing the same kind of heroism either, in a sense that we could have done a lot more in terms of providing weapons to Ukraine. That's really what they need more than anything else, certainly more than our likes and tweets and our posting of the Ukrainian flags. And so there are a lot of echoes, very troubling echoes to Nazi Germany, but also some differences as well.
You mentioned Czechoslovakia. I mean, in certain respects, when you talk about Georgia, we're talking about Chechnya, we're talking about Crimea. These are all aggressive actions that the West more or less kind of just looked the other way on. But I want to ask you in terms of the aspect of where we go with vis-a-vis the response to this at this time. Do you foresee, you talked about the United Nations, any hope that they're going to come forward and do anything on this?
I mean, it's hard for me to see how. It's really hard for me to see how this is going to work, because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. So it's just like a problem that we have with Turkey, where within NATO, where Turkey would have to vote itself out. Russia would have to vote itself out. The Congress started talk about passing a resolution about kicking Russia out of the UN Security Council. It is at this stage purely, the Congress understands very well that that is not going to happen. What was also interesting to me is sometime during this crisis, Zelensky brought up the idea of putting Ukraine on the Security Council. And again, as far as an idea, these are all important ideas. Maybe we will come to a point where this crisis will lead to a fundamental rearrangement of these institutions in light of recognition that they utterly failed in their intended purpose. But I just don't see how we're there yet.
Tell me something I think would be of interest to all of us who are on this call this afternoon, and that is that Putin has been using that term about describing Ukraine as being a Nazi regime, and he's trying to liberate Ukraine from Nazism. I mean, anyone who looks at it realizes that that obviously is not the case. But help us understand a little bit about the use of that language and why he's trying to hold on to that. Does he really believe it, and so on?
Well, first, I'd very much advise, if you have time, to read several of Putin's very famous, rather lengthy articles in the National Interest and several other publications, I believe, about his view of Stalin's pact with Hitler and his entire sort of version of World War II. There is a very deep, very rich, very disturbing narrative that underpins what's happening, and that's what I want to highlight. In Putin's Russia, Stalinism has seen a serious revival, and very slowly you saw the idea of all of these ideas of, I mean, not just these historical facts, really, of the chiefly Stalin's pact with Hitler. This was really the sticking point. Of being at this point becoming a criminal offense in discussing. So that's the level of silencing that this point has reached. The reason why this is so important is because if the Russian people acknowledge Stalin's pact with Hitler, they will have to acknowledge that, at least in part, the Soviet Union played a role in starting World War II. Even as it played a role in ending it, it also played a role in starting it. There's just, it's hard for me to put into words what all of this really means, but this is about a narrative where the Soviet Union had thanklessly sacrificed for the ungrateful Europe. The Soviet Union suffered the heaviest losses due to Stalin, a lot of it due to Stalin's failed policies, but again, the Kremlin does not want to acknowledge that. All of this goes back to a narrative of victimization, a deep-seated narrative of victimization and resentment of the West, and how we come to this idea that the West in this narrative supports a quote unquote a puppet neo-Nazi government. When you bring up the idea of Nazis to the Russian people, that is the most searing pain that you can possibly inflict. It's the most emotional button you can press in the Russian public that still remembers the pain of World War II. That has been especially kind of ramped up in previous years with, again, ideas of Stalinism and World War II and so forth. Every year Russia celebrates the biggest Russian flagship kind of national celebration is a World War II celebration on May 9th, because it's a parade. And what's important about that parade, again, Putin has weaponized even he's weaponized this parade as a means of stoking feelings of patriotism, almost like this, what the Russians themselves had called kind of victory frenzy, if you will. It's called, in Russian, the word is победобесие, literally victory frenzy. So he's whipped up the public. It's kind of it has to do with this picture of kind of this militarization of the Russian consciousness that he's built up for years, and that's why the idea of Nazis has such an emotional resonance.
So we have just a few more minutes left. I want to ask you, if this, we've seen the devastation just within these last couple of weeks, and as you mentioned, within these couple of weeks, it parallels the Syrian refugee crisis that took a couple of years in terms of those numbers. What happens if it's prolonged? In other words, I think everybody thought it may be a couple of weeks, but what if it goes on for a number of months? Will Putin eventually get tired? What's the West to do? And what about the U.S. and companies who are in Russia, vis-a-vis whether or not we saw McDonald's has closed their offices for now and so on, and things like that. So how does this play out longer term? If it continues, and do you think it's going to continue for a while?
I think yes, it's going to continue for at least the next several weeks. I think a lot, again, depends on what types of military aid Ukraine continues to receive, because Russia still has a lot more to bring to bear in terms of brutalizing Ukraine. And what I mentioned before, 5 to 10 million refugees is a very realistic assessment. If basically 1 million refugees a week. This can go on, this can play out in a number of ways. If the Russian military exhausts itself, it would have to be with a lot of help from us providing military equipment to Ukraine. If we create that situation where we fundamentally exhaust the Russian military, it will happen only with our help, I think. And that's the kind of situation where you can see where you can try to put Russia in a more lose-lose situation.
You think the United States may commit forces or
weaponry like MiGs and other types of weaponry. And if Zelensky simply does not have enough weapons, then Putin can, again, as I said before, he can grab strategic parts of Ukraine. You can have a situation of a quagmire, but I think it's going to be a quagmire for us, not just for Russia as well. The situation that I outlined, where he takes parts of East and South with a rump state in the West, with a government in exile and an insurgency that the West is going to support.
Do you think the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way in which we withdrew also was a signal that Putin interpreted?
Absolutely. I absolutely think that was an incredibly important signal, one of many. Again, all of these steps had continuously emboldened him. And what he saw the debacle of the Afghanistan withdrawal, and I used to work in Afghanistan with the U.S. military, with a military contractor. I lived in Kabul for about 6 months. The debacle of how this was handled, Putin read this as an incredible blow to American credibility, and you saw Russian state-connected commentators talking about this. they really took advantage of it to their fullest capacity. So there's no doubt in my mind that he interpreted that as a very serious blow to American credibility, and that also helped him feel emboldened. And fundamentally, it fed hubris. It fed hubris to the point where he thought he could take all of Ukraine in 2 days.
Anna, this has been an unbelievable exploration beyond the news, the headlines, so much in-depth information you've shared with us. I must tell you, though, I'm coming away from all this a little bit scared about the prognosis for peace and peaceful relations. And anything you want to, if there's no hope, you don't have to tell us to be hopeful, but what do you know?
Well, to be perfectly frank, I think we're in for a lot of uncertainty. What worries me the most is what I mentioned in the beginning, that as the refugee flow into Western Europe continues to increase, it will create pressure to create some kind of a settlement that leaves Putin hurt, but not fundamentally in a losing position. And what that means, so kind of wounded. And if that happens, it's only a matter of time before we're going to have to face his aggression again. And so that is what worries me the most, that unless he suffers a fundamental loss from which he cannot return, all these deaths that we're seeing now are going to be for nothing, because we'll see it all over again.
And let me bring it back to Israel in terms of what should Israel learn from what has happened in terms of its military, its foreign policy, its diplomatic policy, and things like that? Because some of its neighbors may be looking at what's happening, be it who want, and who publicly state they wish to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Do they become a little bit emboldened? And as a result, does Israel need to have what should Israel's policy be, and what are their takeaways from what's happening?
So this is again, it's very hard for me to advise. I'm not an Israeli citizen, obviously, but I was most inspired by the interview by Natan Sharansky, who gave this interview in the very beginning of the war, who himself is from Donbass, who said very correctly that it was ultimately President Obama's weakness that made Russia Israel's neighbor to begin with, and now put Israel in a position where it has to deal with Russia and depend on Russia's goodwill to carry out its Israeli airstrikes in Syria. Again, I'm paraphrasing. This is what he meant. So it is that type of weakness that emboldens dictators. That was the core of his message. And Israel as a free country, a country that shares so much with Ukraine, not just in terms of Israeli citizens, but in terms of values, and also a country that knows what it's like to be threatened by a bigger aggressor, to be surrounded by hostile action. I hope that there's a realization, and yet Israel has been in a very difficult position, don't get me wrong, but I was most inspired to see Natan Sharansky's interview, and who seemed to be a minority voice in Israel, but that principle ultimately principle connects with state interest, that you often can't separate values from interests.
Natan Sharansky is absolutely a brilliant analyst as well as a great chess player, and I think he understands the implications further down the road. I want to thank you, Anna Borshchevskaya, for being with us, as well as all of you. This has been unbelievable. Please be sure to take a look at her book, Putin's War in Syria, Russian Foreign Policy and the Price of America's Absence. And also want to commend to you the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. They're on their website, on the homepage of the website, top 7 things you need to know about Ukraine, written by our very own Anna. And I'm sure you probably are going to be needing to update that as the crisis goes on. So today you've really taken us and peeled away what's going on in a very, very disturbing part of the world. We thank you for that. And we will be posting this on the website of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, which is ZionistRabbis.org. So you'll be able to share this with other friends as well. And please, if you're a rabbi and interested in joining what we're doing, please come to our conference coming in Washington, and go to our website to find out more about these things. Anna, and to all of you who are joining us today, thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. Let us conclude with the words of shalom, and the hope that we may know shalom and peace in that part of the world and the rest as well. Toda rabah. Thank you.